Welcome to Parliament Through Time podcast. I hope you are all well and safe. This podcast is about the origins, development and current practices of the institution of Parliament in Europe and the Middle East. Each week we will deliver an overview of certain key topics to enhance our understanding of parliamentary life, what lessons we have learned from the past events, and how these lessons learned can be applied to today's practices. Last week we talked about how the institution of Parliament came into existence. This week, we're moving forward in time, discussing the rise of parliamentary powers and crisis of expectations from parliaments in Europe in the 19th and 20th century. The podcast series is produced by the Westminster Foundation for Democracy in the framework of the European Union Supported Jordanian House of Representatives program. Marko Vujacic, the Committees and Oversight expert in the program, prepared the content of the podcast. I am Lamasawi, your host for this podcast from the heart of Amman, Jordan. Since the Middle Ages or early modern history, many European estates, provinces or countries had some form of an assembly, a diet. There was a long tradition of representing interests with the king or the local ruler, in an orderly negotiation procedure taking place in a fixed location, a town or a building. According to Dutch historians Remiek Ertz and Joop van den Berg, the novelty in Europe at the turn of the 18th to the 19th centuries was a transformation of such assemblies into a popular national representation. In their article, The Ideal of Parliament in Europe since 1800, they argue it was based on the new concept of the nation or the people as a collective entity understood on an equal level or even superior to the king. This new ideal of a parliament as a national and popular representative body originated in the American and French revolutions. Partly, it adjusted the older model of the British Parliament, which shared power with a monarch in a mixed government since the passage of the Bill of Rights in 1689, but actually functioned as a rule of land and property owners, or simply English aristocracy. The prelude to the formation of the French National Assembly was the summoning of the French Estates General in 1789. It was the first meeting of the French Estates General since 1614. The Estates General were the clergy, First Estate, the nobility, Second Estate, and the commoners, Third Estate. Summoned by Louis XVI to propose solutions to France's financial problems, the Estates General convened for several weeks in May and June 1789. It ended when the Third Estate formed into a National Assembly, signalling the outbreak of the French Revolution. Despite these democratic experiments at the end of the 18th century in France and the United States, it was only after 1813, from 1848 and the 1870s onwards, that the idea of constitutional government and the national representation gradually gained force to become the general standard. Parliaments in Europe evolved from a rather modest and upper-class representation with the monarch fully in charge, through an elected body which existed next to the king, first elected by a few and then a wider electorate, to reducing the monarchy to a primarily symbolic dignity, and finally parliaments becoming the centre of power, as in France after 1871. Towards the end of the 19th century, the majority European countries had a parliamentary government, and no longer a monarchical absolutist rule. Like the constitutionalizing process, the spread of parliamentary government has been a transnational phenomenon. Newly emerging parliaments above all intended to represent and to express national traditions and the national state. The names refer to the former representative bodies or appeal to national memories. Spanish Cortes, Dutch Staten-General, German Reichstag, Swedish Riksdag, Serbian Skupština, Danish Folketing, or Greek Vuli. However, the new national parliaments and constitutions were the outcome of an ongoing process of interchange, borrowing, reproduction and adaptation. Parliament in Westminster and the French National Assembly more or less served as models of what a parliament could be to other countries, with regard to procedures, powers and order of the meetings. Ertz and van den Berg explained how 19th century parliaments were faced with the task of making themselves visible to the public. The Spanish Cortes, the Belgian and the French National Assemblies, the Frankfurter Parliament, and even the very much established British Parliament invested significantly in press coverage, theatrical display, public relations, visual culture, ceremony, and a display of dignity. Parliamentary architecture and parliamentary buildings may be the best illustration of the spread of the ideal of Parliament. In their ambition to present themselves as the centre of political power and an attempt to build authority versus a monarch, the parliaments reached for the classical images of power architecture. Ertz and van den Berg noted all the 19th century parliaments provided themselves with a palace, mostly former royal palaces or distinguished government buildings, churches or monasteries, which were given a new purpose. The National Assembly of the Revolutionary Batavian Republic, the successor of the Republic of the Seven United Netherlands and afterwards the Dutch Second Chamber, moved into the Binnenhof and settled into the former ballroom of the ousted stadtholder William V of Orange. The French Chambre des Députés, afterwards the National Assembly, took up its residence in the Palais Bourbon and the Senate in the Palais de Luxembourg. The Italian Parliament made its abode in the former papal Palazzo di Montecitorio. The Belgian Chambre de Représentants, successor to the National Congress that founded Belgium as an independent state in 1831, took its seat in the former building of the Estates General of the United Kingdom of the Netherlands, but converted it into a genuine palace of the nation. The symbolic image of power was already recognizable in the expression Palace of the People or Palace of the Nation. In the second half of the 19th century, many parliaments manifested their rising status through the erection of the prestigious new buildings, when the old lodgings were no longer satisfactory or were damaged by fire. That was the right moment to give expression to the idea of national representation, history, and the relation to the executive and the head of state through the selection of a location, a style, a size, a layout, and a decoration. After 1834, Westminster Palace had to be rebuilt. In Madrid, new Palacio de las Cortes was erected after 1843. And in Bern, the Swiss Confederation presented itself with an impressive Bundeshaus from 1852 onwards. The Norwegian Storting was provided with a new palace in 1866. In Vienna, the Hohe Haus made its appearance from 1874 onwards, and in the German Empire, the monumental Reichstag was erected in 1884. About the same time, new parliament buildings were established in Athens, Budapest, and Stockholm. In part, the grandeur of the parliamentary palaces was defined by their location. They displayed themselves majestically on a hilltop, or a site of historical significance, or situated on a vast square or alongside the main river of the capital city. The Palais Bourbon, housing the French National Assembly, imposingly stands on the dock of the Seine. Neo-Gothic Westminster Palace impressively stretches alongside the Thames. The spectacular Hungarian Parliament building overlooks the Danube River and is deliberately situated across from the Royal Castle Hill. The Austrian Parliament lies on the spacious Ringstrasse. The Greek Fouli, whose new house was built in 1875, moved into the former royal palace on the vast Syntagma Square in 1929. The location was selected not merely for reasons of visibility and standing. A good number of parliament buildings were erected on sites of historical importance, such as ancient strongholds of power or national places of memory. In most cases, the parliament buildings are consciously sited next to or opposite the royal or presidential palace, or the seat of the government. In parallel with the process of parliaments investing in a show and demonstrating of strength, the history of 19th and 20th century in Europe shows the rise of parliamentary powers and competences. This was not achieved without difficulties. There were waves of progress, but also disappointments in what an ideal of parliament should be. The cases of Britain, France, and Germany clearly demonstrate this dynamic. Historians are used to seeing the 19th century as the age of parliamentary expansion in Europe. However, The situation at the beginning of the 19th century was not so bright. After the experiment of the French Revolution, no country thought about adopting universal voting rights, and both the French and British parliaments feared noisy public galleries that, they believed, had such a devastating effect during the Revolution. Even though making laws was part of what they did, parliaments were not the law-making machines they would later become. They were first and foremost the centre of representative government, as it was then called. In his article Between National Character and an International Model, Dutch historian Henk de Wilde paints the picture of the rules and culture of the 19th century parliaments. In practice, he argues, the British and French parliaments were an extension of society. This was not the whole society, but the world that mattered socially, culturally, and politically. An aristocratic or semi-aristocratic world of people who went to London for the London season of cultural events that closely follow the parliamentary season. The same was true for Paris. Many fashionable people left Paris when Parliament was not sitting. Parliament was not only the centre of political, but also of a cultural life in both capitals. It was the constant talk of the town. Parliamentary politics and oratory were discussed at dinner parties, in London clubs, and in the Paris salons that flourished in the first half of the 19th century. Aristocratic society went to Parliament as if they were going to the theatre. In Paris, some MPs criticized the semicircular hall of the Bourbon Palace that is still in use for looking too much like a theatre. The shape of this parliament stimulated a kind of theatrical oratory, delivered from the parliamentary platform. The critics were right in pointing out the differences between the shapes of the halls housing the British and French parliaments, between their public galleries and between the styles of oratory in the two parliaments. However, the similarities in the cultural appreciations of both parliaments were clear. Especially when the great orators would speak, the public galleries were overcrowded. It could be noted that this is interesting only from a cultural point of view, but that it does not concern the real business of Parliament. However, the prestige of the British and French parliaments of the pre-democratic times, characterized by no female presence in parliaments and no universal voting rights, depended on their cultural meaning in a broad sense. Had they been closed administrative bodies, they would not have been popular nor prestigious. Openness, debates, and accessibility to the public is what made them relevant. In the 1850s and 1860s, the future of parliamentary government did not look well. Ertz and Van den Berg argue it was not an exaggeration to call the situation of the mid-19th century a forgotten crisis of parliamentary government. The criticism was directed at the bourgeois and liberal character of the parliamentary order. In the 1870s, social interest groups began to organize themselves in formal political parties, backed by a rapidly expanding press. As expectations with regard to the government, politics, and politicians rose, the claim of the bourgeois, liberal parliaments to represent the people came under attack. In most countries, there was a wide gap between the people who could vote and the common people. With the formation of socialist, republican, conservative, or confessional parties, parliaments themselves became both the object and the arena of a political conflict about the role of the state, the political agenda, or the needs of society. At the same time, the shortcomings of the parliamentary practices, such as the slowness, lack of decisiveness, and the difficult relationship with the executive power, became the subject of criticism. Nonetheless, the parliaments thrived. Even those who criticized it used it as an arena to advance their political agenda. De Wilde describes that by around the year 1900, parliamentary government was seen as the most common form of government for civilized countries in Europe. A parliament had become an institution with internal rules, debating practices, independence from the executive. It had also become an institution connected with the notion of free elections. This required that parliaments come to terms with democratic societies and mass audiences. The voting rights were broadened, general male right to vote was introduced in many countries, and the aristocratic character of the British Parliament was no longer the standard. In particular, in France with its general male suffrage, the system was no longer in the hands of the aristocratic elite. At the same time, from the late 19th century onwards, the most important criteria to judge a modern and successful parliament became its capacity, on one hand, to represent the population, and, on the other, to produce laws that changed and improved society. In the 1920s, the success of parliamentary democracy in the newly formed states in Central and Eastern Europe was seriously hampered by a number of problems. Dissolution of Habsburg Empire resulted in the creation of Austria and Hungary as remnants of a once much larger state, and the Czechoslovakian and Yugoslav multi-nation states. There were serious disproportions in social-economic power within societies. Conservative social structures proved persistent, and a civil society still remained underdeveloped. In the interwar years, a general problem of parliamentary government was its inability to effectively manage the growing tasks and responsibilities of the modern state. Initially, parliaments were designed as instruments of control to curb the power of the executive. They were much less equipped for the active, co-managerial role they now had to assume. For example, parliamentary government in the German Weimar Republic was under strong political pressure during the short period of its existence, until it started to crumble from 1930 onwards. In his article about parliamentarism, Normative Expectations and Criticism of Parliamentarism in the Weimar Reichstag, German historian Thomas Reitel argues it was not only the external factors such as the 1929 world economic crisis that contributed to the downfall of parliamentary government in Weimar, Germany. It was above all the volume of foreign and domestic policy challenges. The right-wing fascist and Nazi parties not only rejected the parliamentary regime, but also parliamentarism in general. Yet, they effectively used their parliamentary presence as a political weapon against the system. The rejection of parliamentarism on the part of the extreme left was also forceful. Among the communists, anarchists, and far-left socialists, parliamentary democracy was regarded as a formal facade to retain the power and privilege of the wealthy and rich class. Reitel explains that the criticism of parliamentarism in the Weimar Republic stemmed from many sources. Firstly, the high expectations towards politics in the face of immense challenges, some of them almost impossible to fulfill, such as financial burdens resulting from the defeat of Germany in World War I. Secondly, almost permanent problems in the formation of the cabinet and the parliamentary backing of the government. To form a government took exceptionally long, while the life of a government lasted on average only 8 months. Thirdly, this created mistrust among political elites and reduced their political capacity to form and sustain the coalition government and act without repeated internal tensions. From 1925 on, and especially after 1930, the ideal of parliament became subject to severe criticism throughout Europe, on 2 levels. Nationalists, fascists, and communists rejected parliamentary democracy as such. Other critics, while approving of the system, often expressed their dissatisfaction with the inadequacy of parliamentary practice. In 1921, in the first wave of enthusiasm for parliamentary democracy after the First World War, there were 21 countries that had adopted a parliamentary government on a more or less democratic basis. By 1940, only 9 were left. Probably the best-known case is the fate of the Reichstag of the German Weimar Republic, which was literally burned to the ground on the 27th of February 1933. After the misery of the Second World War and the hard experience of fascist and National Socialist dictatorship, parliamentary democracy was allowed a new opportunity to establish itself as a humane and efficient political system in Western Europe. It gained public confidence due to the moral example of the victor states, the United States and the United Kingdom, the economic recovery through the Marshall Plan and the New Atlantic Alliance, which implied an ideological opposition to authoritarian communism, which had dominated Eastern Europe and did not allow the development of political pluralism and parliamentarism. After 1945, the Northwest European countries, and also Germany, Austria and Italy, could resume their pre-war parliamentary traditions. This was the dawn of a period of most liberal and democratic constitutional experiences in Europe, apart from the communist countries of South and Eastern Europe. You've listened to the second episode of the podcast Parliaments Through Time, where we explored the rise of parliamentary powers and crisis of expectations from parliaments in Europe in the 19th and 20th centuries. In the next episode, we will be moving closer to the Arab world by discussing the start of parliamentary development in the Middle East and North Africa. Stay tuned and stay safe.